All right, it's time to begin. My name is John Moser, Professor of History and Co-Chair of the Master of Arts in American History and Government program here at Ashland University. Welcome to the second episode of our second season of Documents in Detail, TeachingAmericanHistory.org's webinar series. In each episode, we'll do a deep dive into a single document, discussing the historical, literary, and rhetorical aspects of it, while also analyzing the document's impact on American history, people, and thought. TeachingAmericanHistory.org is a project of the Ashbrook Center, a nonpartisan nonprofit based at Ashland University. We provide a variety of programs and resources for teachers of American history, government, and civics, all based on primary documents. In the next week, you will receive an email with a link to request a certificate of participation, as well as a link to the archived video and audio from today's program. To help us begin to think about the topics of this year's webinars, we are drawing speeches, letters, and writings from the Ashbrook Center's extensive document database available at tah.org. You may participate in the discussion simply by typing your questions into the chat window at the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. You may do that at any time. I will be checking periodically and relaying the questions to our discussants today. The subject of our program this evening is James Madison's Federalist 51, and to help discuss it are Jeremy Bailey, Professor of Political Science at the University of Houston, and Adam Seagrave, Associate Professor of Constitutional Democracy at the University of Missouri. Welcome, gentlemen. Very glad to have you here with us.
Hello.
Thanks.
Glad to be here.
So there's lots that we can talk about here, but let's start with just a very general question. Federalist 51 is generally regarded as one of the very most important of the Federalist papers, probably up there with Federalist 10. I don't know if there are any that come before those two. What's so important about this particular document?
Yeah, so I think you're right. The number 10 and number 51 are the two most famous of the Federalist Papers. They're often the ones included at the back of a college textbook, say an Intro to U.S. Politics textbook. It's something that almost every student in an Intro to U.S. Politics course will read, even if expertise of the professor doesn't lean towards things like the Federalist Papers. So it's a very well-known text, and it's often taught in high school history classes. The punchline of Federalist 51 is separation of powers, and so it's probably the most straightforward and the clearest account of how to make separation of powers work. And so that's the reason for its fame, I think.
Okay.
Yeah, and I would just add to that too. It's very quotable, right? It has some of the best lines in the Federalist Papers. The ambition must be made to counteract ambition. The sentence about that if men were angels, no government would be necessary. Those lines I think are one of the most recognizable, some of the most recognizable in the Federalist Papers, and so I think that contributes to its importance that these succinct, profound statements kind of capture our imagination and our interest in what Publius is getting at here.
Okay. Well, let's talk a little about the context for this. Obviously, the convention met in the summer of 1787, and there were a number of broadsides quickly unleashed against it, against its work. Very important among these is Sentinel Number 1, provided here as a supplemental document of October 5th, 1787. Federalist 51 is, I take it, written in direct response to Sentinel 1. Is that fair to say?
Would you go ahead, Adam?
Yeah. I mean, I think that arguments like those given in Sentinel 1 were what they were responding to here in Federalist 51, what Publius Madison was responding to here. And actually, I think that, so in a way, the Sentinel 1 document shows one of the ways that Federalist 51, I think, helps explain Federalist 10 because it adds an element of the extended republic argument from Federalist 10 that addresses some of Sentinel's objections in a way that Federalist 10 doesn't. And so I'm thinking specifically of the line in the Sentinel document, and I can't really reference a page number here, I guess, but it says, if the administrators of every government are actuated by views of private interest and ambition, how is the welfare and happiness of the community to be the result of such jarring adverse interests? So from Federalist 10, we have sort of the image that I think is often given in textbooks and assumed when people are teaching it, that you have just jarring interests that result in gridlock and don't go anywhere, right? That there's just sort of this non-productive conflict of interests, and Sentinel picks up on that and asks, how are we going to get any sort of community of interest or agreement? And I think Federalist 51, interestingly, does go beyond that in its explanation of the extended republic, and says that justice is the end of government, and that the expectation is that somehow that there will be a sort of substantial agreement produced after the interests and ambitions conflict and collide with one another. And I don't think it's necessarily sort of magical in the way that Sentinel critiques it. So I think that there's at least a window into a solution to that problem of Federalist 10 that is given here in Federalist 51 that responds partly to Sentinel's objection there.
Okay, Jeremy?
Yeah, one thing that I'd point to is in a way they're talking to different audiences, or they have different assumptions. So the first sentence of Federalist 51 tells you a lot. To what expedient then shall we finally resort to maintain in practice the necessary partitions among the government, or something like that? And so how do we? So Federalist 51 is, how do we maintain and practice separation of powers? Sentinel doesn't believe in separation of powers, so he's making a case against separation of powers, and so he's arguing for a simple government instead of a complex government. And what he means is less separation, the better. So, for example, bicameralism, 2 houses, 2 legislative chambers, that's bad from Sentinel's perspective. From Madison's perspective, every sensible person out there agrees the necessity of separation of powers. So Madison is not defending separation of powers. He's explaining how to get it. So in some sense, they have different objectives.
What do we know about Sentinel?
He is one of the Bryan clan from Pennsylvania, and he admires the Pennsylvania Constitution, which is the grand outlier, right, of the state constitutions.
To this day?
It's an outlier because it's a simple constitution. It has a unicameral legislature.
Yeah. And his objection to a bicameral legislature is not so much that separation of powers is going to promote gridlock, but that, in fact, it's designed to bamboozle average people, right, and allow government to pull a fast one, so to speak. Either of you care to comment on that?
Yeah, go ahead, Adam.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's right. I mean, that's one of the points that he hits on over and over again, is that responsibility to the people. That's the check, right? So whereas Madison has set up this elaborate system of a variety of checks, within the institutions of government and between government officials, the check that Sentinel is concerned with is just the simple check of the people on the government, right? The responsibility to the people. And so, I think that's why a unicameral legislature is sufficient, because if you have sufficient dependence on the people, if, as he says, the people are sufficiently virtuous, then they will be jealous of their liberties. They will take their representatives to account for their actions, and you won't need any other checks, right? So I think that's right, and I think that to a certain extent, we do see the element of realism that is often sort of, the caricature of Federalist 51, that we need more than just the check of the people, that Madison says we need more than that, right? Auxiliary precautions are necessary, maybe partly because we can't rely on the virtue of the people, and partly because that won't be sufficient in the extended republic. But yeah, I think that's right. I think Madison doesn't disagree, obviously, with that primary point that the people are the main check, right? The people are the main check on the government, but that's not enough. So I think that's where the disagreement lies.
Jeremy, anything to add to that?
Yeah, just one other point. So Sentinel was talking a lot about John Adams. John Adams had begun to release the early volumes as a defense of the constitutions, and so he means the state constitutions. And that's a defense basically of separation of power systems or complex systems against the alternative of a simple constitution coming out of French political thought from Turgot and others. And one of the things that Adams does is he connects separation of powers with what you might call the old mixed constitution. So in short, the upper chamber or the Senate is going to be something like a House of Lords. It's going to be a place where aristocrats hang out. We could talk more about Adams if we want, but for Sentinel, that's an opportunity for this bamboozling to happen. Is that you're bringing the orders to the system that's going to obscure responsibility, or put a different way, it's going to stand in the way of responsiveness. And by giving these elites a share of power to frustrate responsive government.
Okay. He also thinks that this proposed constitution has too much power over the states, does he not?
Yeah, that's a standard Anti-Federalist argument, and that's the big kahuna. They see, I think correctly, that there's a kind of a zero-sum contest. And that there's a transfer of power and a transfer of wealth in terms of tax revenue from going on from the states to the national government. And so everything is about Congress's power. In some sense, everything is secondary to that. Yeah.
And standing army in time of peace shows up in capital letters. Adam.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think that's right. Yeah, so I guess I would second everything what Jeremy said, that this is a standard critique and one that obviously Madison is at great pains both here and in Federalist 10 we get the big extended republic arguments, and so part of, and again this is particular to Madison, this argument really, but part of what he's trying to show, right, is that those fears are unwarranted because the national government's actually going to be better, right, than the state governments. So that's part of what Madison is arguing here and in 10, to try to allay some of those fears. Well, that the federal government is not going to railroad the state governments the way the Anti-Federalists fear, and B, it actually won't be a distant tyrannical government. It will be better in some ways than the state governments for the reasons that he lays out. So I think he partly tries to counter those arguments through the extended republic argument as well.
Okay. Right. So one of the themes here that Sentinel puts forward is that a confederation of small states, even says, look, some of these big states are realizing they're too big and they want to break up. A confederation of small states that are in which the governors are close to the governed is the way to go here. And that Billy Gallagher asks a question on a related point. Billy says the only true check on the legislative would be election. If you don't like the result, then fix it at the polls next time. This is very much Sentinel's argument. Wasn't the congressional election of 1816 proof that such a check did work?
What do you have in mind with the election of 1816? All that comes to mind is the election of Monroe. So what's going on the Congress part of it?
Yeah, well, let's see if Billy can get back to us with a little more detail on what he means by that. Larry Fata asks a related question: weren't some of the fears expressed by Sentinel well-founded? After all, the only office that the founders trusted the people to elect directly were members of the House.
Yeah. Okay. So let's say that. Let me put it this way. Sentinel's critique has been echoed by political science since the beginning of political science. And that is that political science has long wanted a parliamentary system that avoids the complexities of the separation of power system. And to put it as clearly as possible, the assumption that Madison begins Federalist 51 with is that every sensible person believes that separation of powers is necessary. The question is, how do we get it? That's what Sentinel disputes, and that's also what modern day political science disputes. And they'd say, look, if you look at Japan or England or France, these are more or less well-functioning democracies, at least now. And there's nothing necessary about separation of powers if your goal is preserving liberty.
Adam, any?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think well, and you see, more recently too, the recurring debates about the Electoral College, right? That sort of is the flashpoint that brings this to people's minds, most particularly. But yeah, and also the debate about, well, are we a republic or a democracy, right? Which was, which is salient in some circles and was, of course, a big deal at the time of the founding. Maybe is less so now. I think there's, it's not really the same issue that it was back then. But yeah, I mean, I think that's right. Although at the same time, I think that Madison and in creating and arguing for the separation of powers system of government, I don't think that it was based on an excessive mistrust of the people or of human nature, because I think that sometimes we forget, we paint Madison especially and Hamilton perhaps as elitists who don't trust the people, right, and who are afraid of democracy and afraid of popular government, and so that's why they had to set up this government with all of these cumbersome checks. And but I don't think that's entirely true, because I think that Madison is also very committed to Republican government in the sense of government based on the people. And I think that there is a fundamental faith and trust in ordinary citizens, even in Madison's political thought, although I think it's more limited and balanced and tempered, perhaps, than the faith in the people that some of the Anti-Federalists would have, or that Jefferson, for example, might have. But I don't think that it's that he mistrusts the people or is overly or excessively pessimistic.
Sorry, Jeremy, go ahead.
I was going to take another crack at that, and I'll try to do it in a briefer way than I did before. Madison's response, I think, would be, look, the goal here is to secure rights. The goal here is not to create a responsive government. That's secondary to securing rights. And in order to secure rights, the executive and the legislative power can't be shared, period. That's the starting point. And so today, if you look at parliamentary democracy, where there's no judicial review, there's no veto, the executive and the legislative is all held by the same people, and that's essentially parliament. There is no check on that. And from Madison's perspective, that's dangerous for rights, and so that's a non-starter.
Okay. So is it fair to say that Madison is not so much distrustful of the judgment of ordinary people, but skeptical of their ability to get good information?
Look, I think that's possible, and I think the way that Adam put it out is also possible. My take on these questions with Madison is that it's kind of complex, and that is that separation. The system presumes that people are going to make mistakes in all sorts of venues. So the people might mess up, elites might mess up, presidents might mess up, legislative persons might mess up. And so it's not like trust is taken away from one group and given to another. Rather, it's a suspicion of any one venue being the only venue that can decide things.
Okay.
Adam.
I think Jeremy made a good point when he said that securing rights is the primary goal for Madison, not democracy or representative government. That's secondary to the goal of securing rights. And I think, too, that that Madison and the framers were also concerned with perpetuating the republic over time, right? And so you can have a tremendous faith in people and yet think that over the course of hundreds of years, generations, that circumstances will combine with personalities to produce a tyrannical or despotic government if the right securities aren't in place. So I think that matters too, that government can run fine for generations without the checks in place that Madison thought needed to be there. But would it be sort of perpetuated, for a longer period of time? Obviously, maybe not permanently, but so I think he was concerned with that too, right?
Is there a sense in which Sentinel and Madison are talking past one another? Because if Madison is, to put it in Jeremy's terms, interested in securing rights rather than having responsive government, here is Sentinel, who really who said, well, if you're so concerned with securing rights, why haven't you mentioned a single right in this Constitution?
Yeah, I mean, so the rights part is a talking point that the Anti-Federalists have figured out, and that is that there's no Bill of Rights. So if you want to prove that this thing is really a conspiracy of the few against the many, the best way to illustrate that quickly is to show there's no Bill of Rights. As far as the rest of it, I think Sentinel is mostly a kind of outlier, or put it differently, the state of Pennsylvania or the Pennsylvania opposition are mostly outliers in the sense that they're more democratic, or you might even say more radically democratic than are other Anti-Federalist critics of the Constitution.
Yeah, and I guess I would add to that yeah, I mean clearly the Anti-Federalists and Sentinel, they have the better of that Bill of Rights argument and end up winning that argument. But I think that, yeah, first of all, that Madison is concerned with natural rights, and James Wilson, of course, and others, and think that parchment barriers in the Constitution won't protect those sufficiently, right? So there is that debate, but also that Madison too, and they're not talking past each other in the sense that Madison is concerned with representative government. It's just that he's concerned with it for the sake of securing rights, and because it follows from the demand of right securing. So in Federalist 10, for example, representative government arises for Madison there as a modification of democratic government, right? So he is concerned for democratic government. He's a proponent of it in a way, but it's just not central for him as it is for the Anti-Federalists.
Just one more point on Sentinel before we let him go and really dive into number 51. What do you make of the fact that he closes with this quote from Julius Caesar?
Yeah, I mean, I was actually a little perplexed by that also when I first read it. What does he mean by that? I mean, I guess it seems to me that he's being ironic. Was my interpretation of that. And yeah, and I guess I won't elaborate on it further yet, but that was my interpretation. He's being ironic that Julius Caesar says this, and the government, the new federal government, will be tyrannical as Julius Caesar was.
Sorry?
Who's the speaker? Do we know? Is it Brutus or is it?
That's a good question.
Oh yeah.
I don't know if we have any Shakespeare experts among us who would send me a message indicating that. I can't consult Dr. Google right now. All right, so why don't we jump into 51? Of course, his great central point is this idea that an extended republic is going to provide safeguards against tyranny in a way that a bunch of small states loosely united in a confederation will not be able to do. How can we assess the merit of this? I don't know if I'm putting this the best way, but Sentinel was so convinced that he has the right of the argument, that the bigger we make this thing, the more distant government is going to be from the sovereign, right? That is the people. How do we determine which, rather than instead of just resorting to experience and say, well, we've gotten this far?
Okay, well, I mean, so what you're talking about is basically I'm not sure you can hear me because now I see spinning. I'm going to keep on talking.
I hear you.
Okay, good. You're talking about the kind of the miniature presentation of Fed 10 at the end of Federalist 51. And so that's the argument for the extended republic. And basically, to make the case for Sentinel, it would be that Sentinel has the vast majority of conventional wisdom on his side. And that conventional wisdom would be that in order for a Republican government to work, people have to trust their neighbors, and they have to trust those in power. And so that's going to require proximity to neighbors and proximity to those in power. It's going to require similarity to those neighbors and similarity to those in power. To make a point that somebody else does, how can I trust my neighbor's vote or value his vote if I think my neighbor is doomed to spend eternity in hell? So if there's not sameness about the most important questions, how are we ever going to value each other's votes on political questions? And that's the conventional wisdom. And so here Madison is the the innovative thinker, and is going against conventional wisdom with this rather audacious argument that rights will be better secured in this big, extensive republic.
Yeah, and also, I mean, this argument too was not one that was widely shared among those at the convention or among Madison's friends and fellow framers. That this was idiosyncratic, to Madison, and it's not something that persuaded a lot of people at the time. Actually, as far as I know, it wasn't particularly influential. But of course, it's ingenious, and he states it in a compelling way. But but I think that others at the time weren't persuaded by it, and I think that it's difficult to say, to point out ways in which this has been proven to be the case, to be accurate. There might be ways, there might be instances that we could argue about, but yeah, in terms of assessing its success, I mean, it wasn't particularly persuasive at the time, and as ingenious as it is, it's hard to say, whether it's more persuasive than the alternative today, I guess.
Well, I would, if you wanted to make the case for it, the case would be that this has become perhaps the single greatest American idea, maybe with the exception of religious toleration, but the idea that diversity is good, that if not diversity, pluralistic bargaining is good, that and there's subtle differences with Madison's argument, but the big picture is that having lots of interests contending will over time be better for the common good rather than fewer interests. And there's something, I think, to be said for that, and it's certainly come to be accepted as rather normal in American politics, and as our I would argue the default position that most Americans hold today.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. Sort of the pluralist interpretation of it there. I mean, but I guess so. But that's, I think, perceived as both good and bad, right? That sort of the interest group politics is not looked at favorably by most people today, even if pluralism is, right? So, and I think that in 51, Madison does point also to, as he puts it, a coalition of a majority of the whole society, which could take place on, which says it could seldom take place on any other principles than those of justice and the general good, which again seems to me to go beyond 10, because it seems to indicate that a coalition is possible that will occur on the basis of justice and the general good, which is somewhat different from the clash of interests and sort of mechanistic argument that that people often take it to be. So, but no, I see your point. Your point there. Yeah. Have we lost John?
I hope not.
I don't see him anymore.
Does that mean that we still have an audience?
Probably.
If you're the Ashbrook tech person helping out, why don't you let us know what's up with that? And I suppose you could give one of us access to questions.
Well, yeah, because I can't see the questions that are coming in either, I don't think. Is there a way that we can see chatted? Oh, yeah, we can see questions. Okay.
Oh, yeah, somebody says run with it, play off each other until John gets back.
Oh, there we go.
Okay.
All right.
Great. That confirms it.
Yeah.
So one thing I would say is that the second part of Federalist 51 is not the reason why we read Federalist 51. It's rather the first part.
Yeah, about how the parchment barriers and the separation of powers doesn't work unless there are mechanisms in place to ensure it'll work in practice.
Yeah. So why don't you say more about that?
Yeah. So I mean, I think. I guess that is why we read it, right? The checks and balances, right? That the personal motives and constitutional means, right? As he says there, that's what will ensure the separation of powers in practice, and that's something too. I think that if we're talking about how to teach this in relation to the group of papers that it's a part of, that all of these checks and balances, the mechanisms that Publius is talking about here, are for the sake of ensuring the separation of powers, which in turn is for the sake of, as you said, securing rights, preserving liberty, right? That these aren't there for their own sake. That Madison is not arguing for a sort of a government that doesn't do anything and that is always just stepping over itself and conflictual, right? He's arguing for something that will preserve the separation of powers. So I think that's important to note too, that checks and balances are for the sake of separation of powers rather than the other way around. And I think you see that when you put read 51 after the group from 47 or 46 really onward.
Okay, yeah. So I'll follow that up. I can see the questions now, so participants can keep on asking questions. I can see them, and so I'll field questions in our conversation.
I'm back now too. I don't know what happened. I got kicked out, and it wouldn't let me log back in until just now. So my apologies.
All right, scratch that. While John's getting back, let me.
Well, actually none of the questions that were here are showing up for me now. So you might as well go ahead.
Somebody got back to us, and the speaker, they say, was Brutus, and so that says a lot. Why Julius Caesar was quoted. That changes things. I think considerably. Of course, Brutus being the good guy from the perspective of the Anti-Federalist.
That would have been the history of the Roman Republic would have been the great example or the collapse of the Republic would have been the great example offered by critics of the Constitution, simply because it seemed to suggest exactly what they were talking about. Rome was able to maintain these institutions. They were robust as long as Rome remained relatively small, but then as it became a global empire, it simply couldn't support it. These institutions. So sorry.
Yeah. Good. It reminds me. There's speaking of the Federalist Papers. I think there's a kind of joke in Federalist 70, which begins with the praise of the Roman dictator. Hamilton published Fed 70 on March 15th, which I think is kind of funny. But
that is good.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt the point you were making, Jeremy.
No, just that I said that Hamilton publishes that praise of the Roman dictator on March 15th. So that's Fed 70.
Oh, gotcha. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if you got more questions for us, John. Turn it back over to you.
Yeah, the questions that were here are now gone, unfortunately, since I logged out and relogged in. There was one about the presence of parties and whether that might the formation of parties might have or national political parties might have undermined the strengths of the extended republic. I think I'm getting the gist of that.
So I think the question is in reference to separation of powers, and so the short answer is yes, of course, because now you have a unity between the executive and the legislative through parties and partisanship that wouldn't be there naturally, and that does all sorts of odd things, so just the most immediate way to think about this, maybe to teach your students, is the veto power. Last time I checked, like only 8% of vetoes have been overridden. I think it's fair to say that the framers would have expected the rate to be higher, that there would be more overridden vetoes. There have been 2 impeachments and 0 removals in impeachments, of course, in terms of presidents. That's, of course, because of the supermajority requirement. In our two-party system, it's virtually impossible to get 2/3 vote on anything. So it makes it very hard to impeach and remove a president, way harder than the framers would have expected, I would argue, and that's a very important change in our system because it liberates presidents in a way that they wouldn't be liberated otherwise, because impeachment is effectively off the table. And finally, it makes treaties rather hard too with the 2/3 requirement, and so treaties become increasingly less attractive. And all sorts of devices are now in place to do in-runs around treaties, have trade agreements, executive agreements, so on, that don't require the supermajority requirements of the treaty process.
Yeah. Yes, I think that's right.
Anything on that?
Yeah, they do. I think they do. Do a lot to overcome and affect the separation of powers as originally designed. I mean, I think that's absolutely right. How they affect the extended republic argument part of 51 is a different question, right? And in that case, it's less clear that parties short circuit or overcome or affect the operation of the extended republic. In fact, they may help it work in some ways by sort of collecting within themselves different interests and factions and producing a more coherent policy agenda or platform or out of these clashing interests than would otherwise be there. So they might actually help in some ways, perhaps, the operation of the extended republic. But yeah, with respect to separation of powers, undoubtedly parties are inimical to the separation that was originally instituted.
Let me now take the other side of that and say, look, separation of powers in a way endures remarkably in spite of parties. And so there are lots of things that on one hand, or to put it differently, it's too tempting to say parties changed everything. And so if the goal of separation of power, or let me scratch that. If the argument of Federalist 51, we haven't really talked about it yet, but if the argument is how to make separation of powers work, the question is that. And the answer to that is give each department a will of its own. And so what happens is that the Constitution is designed to give each department its own will or its own personality or its own character. And that personality or character endures in spite of political parties. And so presidents of both parties come to accept a certain notion of the war power that privileges the president. So that's not really a partisan question, that becomes an institutional question. Congress, the opposition party, they kind of switch back and forth, but there does seem to be congressional positions on certain issues about spending and taxation. that Congress is careful to watch over. These aren't merely partisan; some of them remain institutional, and that's certainly true of judges. Judges are very careful, even as they are, casting votes on questions that have partisan debates to them. Judges are very careful to make sure they're doing so in ways that enhance or at least maintain their own power. And so they have to think institutionally in addition to thinking partisanly. And that, I think, is evidence that separation of powers does work, at least according to its design, in spite of the political parties.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think that's right. And
So,
the frustration of to the frustration of some who wish that parties, when they were in power, could simply enact their policy agenda, right? Like, political scientists historically with the dreams of a responsible party system where parties could come into power and enact their policy agenda. Separation of powers has frustrated that. So I think that's right. Yeah.
I've heard back from Billy Gallagher, who gives a little more on what he was driving at by invoking the 1816 election. Congress wanted to raise their pay, so they voted to do so. This did not meet well with the people who voted out those who had supported a congressional pay raise in 1816. So back to his original question, does this not show that the voters themselves are a significant check against the power of the legislature without having to divide it?
Yeah, I mean that's a nice example. The reality is that today members of Congress are virtually unbeatable. Incumbents can't lose. The only way to get in Congress is to hope that somebody dies or has a scandal, and then you move to their district and run. And so you're not going to beat a sitting incumbent, and that's certainly different than the framers' expectations. And so, at the level of responsiveness, it turns out that in some respects the president is more responsive than say the House, and that would be something that Sentinel would have not predicted.
I would have. I mean, if I were Sentinel, I would say that shows how the districts are simply too large, right? One of the reasons why it's so difficult to get rid of somebody who get rid of a seated member of Congress is that there are simply too many voters out there for each district.
Yeah, maybe, or maybe it's because they're too gerrymandered. I mean, there various explanations.
Yeah, sure. Okay. Another question. Federalist 51 emphasized authority and ambition. So the questioner is thinking of Jackson in this setting as an executive. Would Madison reconsider or agree with Jackson's famous quote, "Marshall made his ruling, let him enforce it"?
Okay, so my take on this is just in terms of the narrow example, without getting into the weeds. My understanding is that this is in a way a kind of a comment or an apocryphal comment that didn't really have relevance. There was nothing for Jackson to do at the level of federal enforcement of this decision. So it's not like Jackson withheld action in Worcester v. Georgia. But that's my understanding of the narrow thing. But the principle is way more interesting, and the principle is to what extent did Madison believe in something like coordinate review or departmentalism as an alternative to judicial review, interpreted as judicial finality, that is, the judges have the final say on the Constitution. And I think it's clear, it doesn't come out in the Federalist, but it comes out very quickly, as early as 1789, that Madison believes that each department may interpret the Constitution for itself. And that's what Jackson says in his bank veto statement. So that's in a way the better Jackson example. And that, I think, Madison more or less agrees with it, with some caveats.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think, the principle that each department should have a will of its own that's reflected in that example as well. I mean, I think that's something, Madison would have been in favor of, the fact that it's not a given that when one department does something, say makes a law, that the executive will will enforce it just as the legislative lays out, right? That the executive has a will of its own as well. It has a job to do in executing the law, but I think that the separation of powers scheme allows for that, and that's a sign that it's functioning. I think that it's not running as a finely tuned machine where there's no pause from the process of legislating to executing to judging, right? I think that to have those the different wills in each department in place, I think that's reflected in that example, and Madison would have been in favor of that.
Okay. David Cedar says the idea that a second chamber would represent the interests of the elite against the many seems to be the overriding argument against bicameralism. However, to modern minds, this seems a bit disingenuous because only property owners, one might add white male property owners, could actually vote in the early republic, let's say, pre-Jackson. When one says that the more simplistic structure is beneficial to the general interest of the public, the danger of the general interest does seem more pronounced, with a concentration of power in just one branch with no counterbalancing power. Care to comment on that?
Yeah. Okay. So let me address first a little bit of clutter, and that's the property stuff. It's not the case that voting was extended only to whites, and it's not the case that voting was extended only to property-owning whites in the beginning. That there are exceptions to that in a variety of states. Another complicated example is Massachusetts did have property qualifications for voting, yet the Massachusetts Constitution was ratified by every male, regardless of property. And so in Massachusetts, the requirement of property to vote was actually approved by those who were not going to be allowed to vote. So that they, in fact, voted not to allow themselves to vote, or at least they to participate in that process. So the property stuff is complicated. Now, but back to the Senate. What in my view, what you have is, and I'm not using this in a pejorative sense. There's a kind of an incoherence with respect to the purpose of a Senate, and there are sort of three possibilities. One is the John Adams possibility, and that is you need a place, an upper chamber, to stick the aristocrats, because they're going to call, well, in John Adams' example, they're going to cause trouble, and so better give them a home. And they're going to be able to be isolated that way, and the executive and the lower house will be able to team up against them. That's the logic for John Adams. For others, you need that upper house of elites in order to give property representation, to give the wealthy a say in the making of law. For others, a Senate is necessary simply as a feature of bicameralism, that there is no normative principle associated with it. It's rather just a second chamber operating in order to make it harder to pass laws. Mm-hmm. It turns out for that group of people, it's very convenient that the Senate becomes a venue for state equality, for the kind of compromise to go through, and for federalism to be represented again in the U.S. Constitution. And so in that sense, this is not a question of wealth or representation of wealth, but rather a channel by which the compromises over the federal relationship would work. Now, different people in the convention have different reasons then for supporting the Senate. That's the point. Okay. All right.
Yeah. So that argument of Adams, that sounds like Machiavellian, the discourses. You have to give the elites, the property owners, a stake in the system, or else they'll bring it all down. Is that where Adams got that?
Yeah, it's there. Go ahead, Adams.
I was going to say, I think that is there. I think, and he cites Machiavelli, I think, as well, fairly frequently. So I think Adams would admit that it's Machiavellian. And I would add to just what Jeremy said there. That another reason that's given in, I think it's in 47 for having the bicameral legislature is simply to weaken it, because the legislature is the most powerful branch of government, right? That talking about the checks and balances, part of the way you're going to balance the government is by weakening the legislature as a whole. And if you have two separate chambers with two different personalities or functions, then they will check each other and weaken the legislature as a whole. So I would add that as well.
Well, this gets us this gets us directly to a question from Larry Fata. Along those lines, I've always found it fascinating that Madison envisioned the legislative as the quote-unquote dangerous branch that needed to be more hemmed in, while the executive was in need of fortifying. Of course, that seems odd today, considering at least the 20th century has been the story of the quote-unquote imperial presidency. The question is how did this happen, and can the pendulum swing back?
Okay, so the passage begins, the paragraph in Fed 51, it's a couple paragraphs in, but it is not possible to give each department an equal power of self-defense. In Republican government, the legislature necessarily predominates. The remedies divide in two, and then to give each different set of principles and motive of action. That's the idea that he's talking about. And so he's right. The questioner is right that you can't understand separation of powers without understanding that it's about controlling the way to solve separation of powers in the United States is to fix the problem of legislative tyranny. So, for example, Federalist 9 refers to checks and balances, but it calls them legislative checks and balances. And so we teach checks and balances, but Publius only talks of legislative checks and balances. That's another example of that. The explanation for that, one is theoretical. I think that's less interesting. The historic explanation in this case is that they just endured, from this perspective, a decade of legislatures gone crazy, and they're trying to fix what they see as a problem. And so they all believe in separation of powers. The Virginia Constitution of 1776 begins with, more or less, thou shalt have separation of powers. So they want separation of powers, but in practice, the legislative power had taken over the powers of the other two branches. So fixing that was the goal here.
Okay.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think in terms of what's happened, why that hasn't been the case, how it could be, how the legislature could be, fixed if it needs fixing. I mean, I think that's right. That definitely it hasn't. Our experience hasn't borne out the dangers of the legislature. Maybe partly because they were so effective. The splitting into the two houses, and maybe that was part of it. I think the sheer size of the Congress, and relative to the executive and the court, that it requires deliberation and discussion, and the adjustment of interest and all those sorts of things that I think have always been difficult, but in the extended republic and over time, it's gotten more and more difficult to deliberate in common as a body in Congress. And so I think that that has contributed to it. I think the sheer number of people and their inability to deliberate effectively in common.
Yeah. Let me push back on the question too in another way, and that is with respect to our current politics. And so we talk about an imperial presidency, and I think it's clear that Americans have asked which branch is most dangerous. They probably wouldn't name Congress first. They probably should say the president. That being said, it seems like what the 20th century shows us is that Congress, when it's either paralyzed, or when it passes major legislation, it's legislation that is totally burdened and changed and transformed by narrow interest affecting narrow groups. And what you see, on the other hand, is a president trying to fight for the whole United States, trying to push policies that the president says are in the public good, and a reluctant Congress or an ineffective Congress. That story is not one of the president being able to actually get what he wants. This is mostly a story of presidential failure. And we go through president after president after president where these signature accomplishments are just decimated by Congress. And so it seems to me that the action is still in Congress, or to put it differently, the potential danger is still in Congress. That there's the potential danger is not really with the president. And we could think about a whole litany of policies that are in the air today, and basically everybody's waiting for the next shoe to drop, and that shoe is, will Congress be able to pass a law that the administration wants?
That's a terrific point, yeah. In the brief time remaining, can we bring Federalist number 47 into this? How does this contribute to the argument?
Go ahead, Adam.
Well, I think that, by going through each state constitution, and showing the ways in which each of them, although they profess to endorse separation of powers in principle, that in practice that the powers are, they overlap and are mixed in various ways. That I think that's a, it's an effective argument that he gives here to show that the principle as the Anti-Federalists understand it and as they're pushing it, must be not quite the strict version of it that they're giving, right? That really separation of powers does not require an absolute separation, so the Constitution can't be criticized on those grounds. And so the examples of the state constitutions is helpful, I think, for that argument that Publius is making.
Yeah, so the punchline, just to repeat the point, the punchline is that separation of powers does not mean no mixing. Separation of powers means no control of the other branch, which fits with number 51, no control of the will of another branch. So the will is the key. The other passage in Fed 47 that I think is probably the best is I think it's the third paragraph, where he says no political truth is certainly of greater intrinsic value or stamp, et cetera, then the accumulation of all powers, legislative, executive, and judiciary in the same hands, whether one, a few, or many, et cetera, or whether hereditary, self-appointed, whatever, blah, yada, yada, may justly be pronounced the very definition of tyranny. So it doesn't matter if it's the one, the few, or the many. It doesn't matter if it's hereditary, elective, whatever. If you combine the legislative power and the executive power in the same hands, that's tyranny.
And that's striking for another reason too, that it's not the tyrannical operation of government that's accumulated, all these powers in the same hands, but it's the mere accumulation, which I think is also noteworthy. Yeah,
right. So that is, I think, in a way, it's an opportunity to reflect, on the truth of that statement. And so, if my university president can do anything, is that the very definition of tyranny?
Mm-hmm. Even if he doesn't do anything.
Yeah, and I would say the answer to that is yes, right? That I would like to see, the president be guided by things like a faculty handbook. I would like some of the powers to be carved out and given to the provost, and that these are things that we see as ordinary in the usual course of things. For another example is if you disagree with something, you don't attack the substance. You call it unilateral. And by calling it unilateral, you've somehow, changed it. That if the person is making this decision, acting and deliberating all by themselves, then there's something iffy about it.
And this goes back to Montesquieu's definition of liberty in the spirit of the laws, which is the opinion of security as well. So Montesquieu is cited later, but I think they're thinking about his definition of liberty here as well, because it's not. He defines it not as the enjoyment of actual security, but the opinion of your security. Right.
All right. Well, that is about all the time we have tonight. I want to thank both of our panelists, Adam and Jeremy, as well as our participants for the great questions they offered. Just a reminder, you will be receiving an email with a link for a certificate of participation if you would like one. If you have enjoyed today's webinar, please consider taking an online graduate course through the Ashbrook Center. These are offered as part of our Master of Arts in American History and Government program. This is something near and dear to my heart, and is also a program in which both Adam and Jeremy are regular members of our faculty. You can find more information about Ashbrook's online course offerings at teachingamericanhistory.org. You can also help us spread the word about these programs by sharing the archive link, which you'll receive by email next week. Please share that with your colleagues and on social media if you're a social media person. Our next Documents in Detail webinar will be Wednesday, October 18th. Our subject that evening will be the Monroe Doctrine. At that time, I'll be joined by Dr. Eric Pullen of Carthage College, and Dr. Jay Sexton of the University of Missouri. You probably know him, Adam. The recommended readings for that webinar have already been posted, so we hope to see you back here on October 18th. Thanks again, and have a great evening.